You have probably heard plenty of stories about European brands trying to conquer the American car market, and quite often, they actually succeeded. But the opposite situation, when American companies tried to conquer Europe, is a far less well known story, and Chrysler was not planning to limit itself to simply exporting its cars. The company intended to become a full fledged European automaker. What came out of that? We are about to find out. As surprising as it may sound, the story of Chrysler's European ambitions should begin with Ford. It was Ford that became the first American manufacturer to understand that in Europe, it was not enough to simply sell American cars. To succeed there, you had to build and sell truly European automobiles. Back in 1909 in the United Kingdom and later in 1925 in Germany, Ford opened its European divisions. At first, they simply assembled American Ford models, especially since the differences between European and American cars were still not that dramatic at the time. Although the European branches already had a certain level of autonomy, this was how the British developed the quite successful Anglia. After World War II, Europe and the United States began living in completely different economic realities. In America, highways were being built everywhere, the middle class was growing, the suburbs were expanding, and gasoline remained cheap. American cars kept getting larger with huge, fuel-hungry engines, soft suspension, and automatic transmissions. Europe at the same time had no interest in luxury. The continent had been devastated by war, resources were in short supply, and fuel was expensive. Typical European cars of that era were compact, with small, economical engines and manual transmissions. British and German Ford engineers understood this reality perfectly well and quickly came to the conclusion that selling American Ford cars in post-war Europe would be madness, especially since the high level of autonomy meant they did not have to spend long convincing the bosses in Detroit. The British division developed the Anglia and later the Cortina. In Germany, the larger Taunus appeared. All of these models became hugely successful, and from the 1950s through the 1970s, Ford UK was one of the country's leading automakers. And to once again show just how different the American vision of the automobile was from the European one, Ford never even attempted to bring its European models to the American market, even though in theory they could have competed with the German Beetle. Americans still viewed the Beetle as a temporary anomaly, whose popularity would eventually disappear, so they saw little reason to seriously enter that fight. In 1967, Ford merged its two European divisions into one company called Ford Europe. The first model from this new organization was the 1968 Escort, which was no longer British or German, but a truly pan-European Ford. After the merger, Ford Europe became one of the main examples of global automotive integration in the 20th century. Models created later, such as the Fiesta, Capri, and Granada, became highly successful in Europe and provided the company with stable profit. After World War II, Chrysler chose a very different path in Europe. For a long time, the company simply exported its American cars there, including Dodge, Plymouth, and DeSoto models. Demand for them was extremely low, and they were seen more as overseas curiosities than as serious players in the European market. Meanwhile, by the 1960s, the European market was rapidly recovering. Economies were growing, the effects of the war were gradually fading away, and buyers could increasingly afford not just tiny post-war economy cars, but full-sized sedans. Full-sized, of course, by European rather than American standards. And it was at that moment that Chrysler began to realize that while Ford and GM had spent years developing their European divisions, Chrysler itself effectively had no real foundation in Europe. Because of this, Chrysler rushed to create its own European division. But there was no longer enough time for slow development from scratch. So the Americans decided to build their European empire by buying local manufacturers. The starting point is usually considered to be 1963, when Chrysler began purchasing a stake in the British Rootes Group, which owned several brands and was one of Britain's more significant automakers. In the same year, Chrysler acquired a major stake in the Spanish company Barreros Diesel and gained controlling interest in the French manufacturer Simca. After the initial chaos began to settle down, Chrysler started taking a closer look at its new acquisitions. Barreros produced diesel engines, trucks, and commercial vehicles. while also building Spanish versions of the Dodge Dart for the closed and heavily regulated Spanish market of the Franco era. The purchase turned out to be rather complicated. On one hand, Chrysler gained access to the Spanish market. On the other, the market itself remained heavily restricted, while conflicts inside the company quickly began growing with the founder of Barreros Diesel. And overall, Barreros was not really a full passenger car brand. So this acquisition solved more local problems than it truly strengthened Chrysler's position in Europe. The situation with Rootes Group turned out to be far more difficult. Rootes remained primarily a British manufacturer with weak positions outside the United Kingdom. On the European market, the company could hardly compete with Ford, Opel, Fiat, or Renault. But even that was not the main problem. Back in the 1950s, Rootes still looked like a serious player. The company produced passenger cars, commercial vehicles, and even military equipment, while its position inside Britain and across the Commonwealth remained fairly strong. But by the 1960s, Rootes had begun falling noticeably behind its competitors. While Ford, UK, British Motor Corporation, and Vauxhall were modernizing their production, Rootes remained far too conservative. Management was becoming outdated, the company still controlled too many separate brands, and its financial problems kept getting worse. At the same time, Rootes understood perfectly well what kind of car the market wanted in the 1960s, and tried to save itself with a new model called the Hillman Imp. The compact, rear-engine car turned out to be quite successful, and even received strong reviews from the automotive press. But in the end, the Imp became a financial disaster for Rootes. A completely new factory was built in Linwood, Scotland, specifically to produce the model. The location was chosen largely for political reasons in order to create jobs in the region, but it was located far away from Britain's traditional automotive centers. This led to problems with staffing, build quality, and logistics. Engines were produced in Coventry. Many components had to be transported across the country, and the entire production process quickly became expensive and poorly organized. In the end, poor reputation, enormous costs, the dominance of the Mini, and constant strikes effectively finished off Rootes Group. And it was at exactly this moment that Chrysler fully bought the company. Today, that decision may look almost insane, but back in the 1960s, Chrysler management viewed all of these problems as temporary. What mattered most was that the Americans were gaining manufacturing facilities in Europe and access to the British market. The French company Simca turned out to be perhaps Chrysler's most successful acquisition. The company had strong positions in France and Southern Europe, while its lineup looked modern and well-structured. The core of its sales came from the front-wheel drive Simca 1100, which became a true bestseller for the brand. Below it sat the compact rear-engine Simca 1000, while the larger Simca 1300 and 1500 covered the family sedan segment. It was this diverse collection of companies that eventually formed the foundation of Chrysler Europe, created in 1967. After the creation of Chrysler Europe, the Americans began actively investing money into their European divisions and gradually promoting a unified Chrysler brand. Simca became the foundation of Chrysler's European business, since its models were modern and sold well. Despite statements about eventually abandoning the Simca name, the Americans were in no hurry to do so, fully understanding that Chrysler's brand recognition in Europe still remained weak. Chrysler acted much more aggressively with its British division. Rootes Group was in serious financial trouble and required constant investment. Chrysler also had no intention of keeping most of the local brands, which were barely known outside the United Kingdom. With the exception of the commercial Commer lineup and the Hillman Imp, most Rootes products were considered to have no real future. At the same time, Rootes still had a strong engineering base and a large dealer network. It was British engineers who were entrusted with developing a new model that was supposed to become a pan-European Chrysler in the future. The project originally began as the Rootes Avenger, but by the time the car entered production in 1970, Chrysler was already actively restructuring the company into Chrysler Europe. And this was exactly where the typical American chaos with names and positioning began. In Britain, the car was sold as the Hillman Avenger, and later as the Chrysler Avenger. In continental Europe, it was simply the Chrysler Avenger, while in North America, it became the Plymouth Cricket. In South America, meanwhile, the names and badges changed so often that understanding the entire system today is quite difficult. The Avenger itself was a compact C-segment family car with a front-mounted engine and rear-wheel drive. The car turned out to be fairly successful and sold especially well in Britain. But in North America, the model attracted almost no interest, while in Britain itself, the Avenger still remained in the shadow of the Ford Escort. The Chrysler 180, which appeared in 1970, a few months after the Avenger, was a far more unusual project. Its story had begun even before the merger with Chrysler, when Simca and Roots were independently working on new, large family sedans. After Chrysler arrived, the Americans asked a fairly logical question. Why would the company need two cars in the same class? In the end, both projects were merged into one. British development work, French engineering, and the American desire to create a European Chrysler eventually turned into the Chrysler 180. The result was rather mixed. The Chrysler 180 looked like an American car that had been adapted for Europe. Visually, it appeared too American, while technically, it remained fairly ordinary and was also clearly underpowered for its size. As a result, the model sold poorly and failed to compete properly with cars like the Opel Rekord and Ford Granada. After the lukewarm reception of the Chrysler 180, Chrysler Europe began relying more and more heavily on its French division, Simca. It was the French who had already shown by the late 1960s that the European market was gradually moving away from traditional rear-wheel drive sedans toward more practical front-wheel drive hatchbacks. The main proof of this was the Simca 1100, one of the most successful French cars of its time. A spacious interior, front-wheel drive, and a hatchback body unexpectedly turned out to be exactly what the European market of the 1970s wanted. At the same time, Chrysler Europe's financial resources were already becoming limited, so the company could not afford to develop an entirely new platform. In 1972, it was decided to essentially expand the Simca 1100 concept by making the car larger and moving it into a higher class. The new model kept the same overall philosophy as the Simca 1100, front-wheel drive, a transversely mounted engine, and a practical five-door body. But at the same time, the car became noticeably larger, roomier, and more mature. And unlike the awkward Chrysler 180, this time Chrysler Europe finally matched the mood of the European market almost perfectly. Familiar Simca engines with displacements of 1.3 and 1.4 liters were used as the base power plants. Despite their fairly simple design, the more powerful 85 horsepower version delivered quite respectable performance by the standards of the mid-1970s. The Simca 1307 was first presented to the public at the Paris Motor Show in October 1975, and by the end of the same month, the Chrysler Alpine was shown at the London Motor Show. For the French market, the Simca name was kept, while in most export markets, the car was sold as the Chrysler Alpine. In the same year, 1975, the model won the European Car of the Year award, something that made Chrysler Europe management extremely happy. In France, the new Simca 1307 became a genuine hit. For the local market, it was almost the perfect successor to the Simca 1100. The same practical front-wheel drive hatchback, only noticeably larger, more modern, and more comfortable. Demand became so high that Chrysler Europe initially struggled to keep up with production. Just 1 year after launch, more than 250,000 cars had already been built. The situation in the United Kingdom turned out to be much more complicated. There, the Alpine did not replace existing Chrysler Europe models, but instead complemented the more traditional Avenger and Hunter. The problem was that the British market of the mid-1970s still remained fairly conservative. Corporate fleets continued buying huge numbers of Ford Cortinas and Morris Marinas, while a front-wheel drive French hatchback with a small engine looked too unusual to many buyers. But despite all of this, the Alpine still became the most successful car in the history of Chrysler Europe. The paradox was that Chrysler Europe's most successful model appeared at the exact moment when the entire company was already deep in crisis. After the 1973 oil crisis, Chrysler's financial position was seriously shaken, while the European division continued demanding enormous investments. Gradually, Chrysler Europe began turning into a heavy and increasingly questionable asset for Detroit. In January 1976, after long negotiations, Chrysler and the British government reached an agreement about the future of the company's British operations. In exchange for financial support, Chrysler agreed to several conditions, one of which was assembling the Alpine for the British market in Coventry. Starting in August 1976, the model was assembled there from kits supplied from France. In addition, the British government provided a grant for the development of a new compact hatchback that was supposed to keep the Scottish factory operating and avoid further layoffs and strikes. But the grant itself was not enough to develop a completely new model, while Chrysler itself no longer wanted to seriously invest in its European division. Because of this, the decision was made to use a shortened Hillman Avenger platform. This was how the Chrysler Sunbeam appeared, a very British, very compromised, and very inexpensive car to develop. The agony of Chrysler Europe came to an end in 1978, when Peugeot fully bought the Americans' European business. A year later, the Chrysler and Simca names disappeared, replaced by the revived Talbot brand. The fate of the former Chrysler Europe models turned out very differently. Some, like the Chrysler 180, disappeared fairly quickly and almost without a trace. The Talbot Alpine remained on the market for some time, but it was rapidly becoming outdated and gradually losing its position in Europe. The Talbot Sunbeam was also sold only briefly and without much success. But it was the Sunbeam that received the famous Talbot Sunbeam Lotus version, which became a cult car for many enthusiasts and even brought Talbot the WRC manufacturer's title in 1981. After leaving Europe, Chrysler's situation in the United States was also becoming extremely difficult. By the end of the 1970s, the company was on the edge of bankruptcy and was effectively fighting for survival. It was at this moment that Chrysler was taken over by Lee Iacocca, who had previously left Ford. In many ways, he was the man who later saved the company, but that is a separate story that probably deserves its own video. And Chrysler itself would eventually return to Europe decades later, but this time as part of the Stellantis Corporation. Ironically, the company once again found itself inside the same automotive giant alongside the former PSA assets, the successors of the very same Peugeot that had once bought Chrysler Europe.